This is the second part of the three-part lecture on chapter 4 of our book. This is going to look at, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, but really it's about the Revolution and print culture. The Enlightenment is part of the story here, big part of the story. The Great Awakening is also part of the story, but not so much. If we're looking forward towards the Revolution, the Great Awakening isn't as important. But the colonists at this time period aren't, they don't know they're going to have a revolution, so we need to go over that. Okay, so I want to start by talking about print culture. Print culture is like printed stuff, right? You all learn this in whatever patterns or AP World or Modern World, 1450, Gutenberg Bible, and then you kind of drop it, right? Printing press. The guy had a printing press. He printed the Bible. He printed it in German. It was kind of a big deal. And then you don't really talk about printing that much anymore. Print culture is a really, really big factor in this time period. A very, very important thing. As it says right here. It plays a role in everything. The dissemination of information, the creation of new nation states, radicalism, politics, philosophy, you name it, because just like the internet is important for our modern time period, right? The printed word was as important then. And the fact that it wasn't just Bibles and great books that were being printed, but rather pamphlets, tracts, cookbooks, manuals, all of this kind of cheap stuff, newspapers, people were printing their own newspapers. All of this helped to disseminate information. So why is this happening? Well, we are talking about the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, right? So new technologies are cheaper. The printing presses are easier to make. And these are like, you have to put all the pieces together yourself. There's a printing press museum in Lomita or maybe Torrance. It's very good. It has the kind of evolution of all the different kinds of printing presses and stuff. This time period, they become cheaper because of industrialization. Obviously, also, what are they printing it on? On paper, right? Where does paper come from? From timber. Where are they getting the timber? From all of these trees, right? As the colonists push west and expropriate land, they're cutting down trees. Those trees are going to mills, and they're making paper out of some of it. Okay, information can move further, a lot further, because people are reprinting stuff. So if I am a printmaker in Worcester, Massachusetts, I might subscribe to a newspaper from South Carolina or from London. And when I see an interesting article, I'll just reprint the thing in my newspaper, right? The whole thing. And this is quite common. People just it's like retweeting or something. I don't know, right? That you're amplifying the message. So information moves a lot further. More people are reading. Actually, this is an interesting fact that in 1775, more newspapers were printed in Worcester, Massachusetts, than in all of England, right? So the colonists are all about this. If you were someone who had a little bit of money and you were learned and interested in politics or something, you would just get your own printing press. It's not a big deal. It's not like a huge factory or something, like the way you think of like printing newspapers, it's a whole enormous room. This is like printing presses are fairly small, right? They're like the size of like a compact car. So if you had the space and the money, you might get a printing press and just start printing your own thing, right? Your own newspaper. This is an important kind of political concept. There's a historian, Benedict Anderson, who coined this phrase, imagined communities. And he ties this idea to the emergence of print culture, right? That when the Gutenberg Bible, for example, right, it starts getting printed in German, suddenly people who speak German and can read that say like, oh, we're similar, right? Where if you think of the Holy Roman Empire, some people spoke German, some people spoke Hungarian or Walloon or Dutch. So that was one like polity, a political entity where a bunch of people spoke different languages, right? Carlos V of Spain didn't even speak Spanish. He's born in the Netherlands, right? But once things start getting printed, people start reading in the vernacular or in a language, not Latin, right? So German, Dutch, English, whatever. And they start seeing themselves as a community that speaks this language, that reads this language. So that's in the 15th and 16th century, but on into the 17th and 18th and into the 19th century, people start reading the same stuff. They read about each other. Someone in Maine is reading about something happening in Georgia, and vice versa, and they begin to see each other as kind of connected, right? And that is this idea of an imagined community. Why do you feel any kinship towards any other kind of like an American, right? You're not going to meet someone in, whatever far-flung part of the country, but on some level, if you heard someone speaking English with an American accent and you were in, I don't know, rural China or France or wherever, you'd be like, oh, hey, all right. What's that about? Why? Right? Because there is this sense of an imagined community. You need to have an imagined community to have a modern nation state, says Benedict Anderson. And we see it evinced here with the advent of print culture. This is why Ben Franklin becomes who he becomes. This is a major factor in revolution. That this stuff is getting printed and colonists are reading it. So we have the proof, right? It's in the pudding, as they say. Religion. So let's talk about religion and then the Enlightenment. Look, Protestants, they don't mess around when it comes to reading, right? Part of Martin Luther's whole thing is that you don't need Catholic clergy to be intermediaries between you and the Word of God, right? You can do it on your own. Do it with the reading group, a Bible study, whatever, right? So Protestants are all about reading, and that's why Protestants want people to read. That's why public education as a concept emerges in New England in the 1830s, because they're still very interested in, in order to be a good Protestant, you need to be able to read the Bible. So that's a thing, right? And then print culture is part of that. The Great Awakening, or the first Great Awakening in this time period we're talking about now, there's another one 100 years later we'll get to in several months. People are less religious, right? They're less religious than they were. I mean, obviously, the Puritans are all about it, right? They're all about that, their religion. By the 1740s, 50s, people are less religious. People like George Whitefield, your book makes a big deal of Whitefield. He's the most associated with the Great Awakening. This cartoon in the background is a kind of satirical cartoon of George Whitefield. He was accused, just like, who was this, Jerry Falwell, right, who was just junior, just kind of fall from grace. He was evangelical minister and president of Liberty University. Well, he's got in trouble because of, extramarital affairs or whatever it is. Well, that's now. Back then, people were criticizing evangelical leaders for similar things, right? That he's all in it for the money. It's just about him. He's exploiting his followers. And this cartoon is that. He had an eye condition where he would have to squint. So Dr. Squintum, they're not unfamiliar with ad hominem attacks. And then Jonathan Edwards, another very famous one. I mean, he was, if you're a fan of Hamilton, in the Wait For It song, right? Leslie Odom Jr. as Aaron Burr, when he says that his grandfather was a fire and brimstone preacher. That is Jonathan Edwards, right? So Jonathan Edwards is Aaron Burr's grandfather, and he was indeed a fire and brimstone preacher, right? And he's an evangelical preacher. So that is the Great Awakening. In the South, they've got Presbyterians and Baptists. That's all you need to know, right? If we're going to talk about the Great Awakening in religion, most of the focus is going to be in New England, because a lot of Southerners are still a Church of England. South is more conservative. There's more Church of England Anglicans in the South than in the North. The Old Lights, this is not hard to remember. Old Lights are the old school Protestants. The New Lights are these new school evangelicals. That's the Great Awakening. Now, the Enlightenment. On the other hand, we have the Enlightenment. These are two polar opposites, and they're two opposites that are important to understand. Again, just like I said in the last lecture, these various groups and ideas and beliefs that drive the revolution forward aren't necessarily in harmony. They believe very different things. So on the one hand, the Enlightenment is going to push forward this idea of a democratization of things, right? Because the evangelicals in this time period are all about the people coming to these, right, right? These revivals and having these religious experiences. It's very direct. It's very participatory. That religious participation is a democratic movement. Also, the Enlightenment, this logical thinking of like a king. Are you kidding me? Like, this is an Enlightenment idea, right? That it's not logical. It doesn't make any sense. But those two things, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening, they don't get along, right? And to some degree, the Great Awakening is in a response to the Enlightenment with the rise of deism, which is like, yeah, there's a God, but like, he's just like the best watchmaker in the universe. He made the watch. It's a perfect watch. It's perpetual motion. It runs on time. It's never off. And that just goes. And God steps back. We don't need God anymore. Kind of like, if the watch works, we know what time it is. That is kind of an understanding of kind of a stripped down understanding of deism. Obviously, part of the Enlightenment scientific rationality, all the way back to Bacon and the scientific method on forward. It encourages skepticism, like, the Red Sea parted and they walked. Come on, like, there's a lot of stuff that would lend itself to skepticism about some of the stuff in the Bible, right? He moved the rock and then he resurrected. Like, come on, show me the evidence. Show me the scientific method that proves that. So it's skeptical of religion. John Locke is a major figure in the Enlightenment, but in particular when we're talking about the Enlightenment in APUSH. He is the kind of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears sweet spot between, on the one hand, Thomas Hobbes, who's a little too cold with his understanding of what people's rights are versus the king's rights. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a little too hot. He gives the people too many rights, right? Very influential over the French Revolution. John Locke is that just right medium position, right? And that's why he's so influential over the American Revolution. This idea of natural rights, that we have certain inalienable rights. This is something that precedes the founding documents of the United States. They say inalienable rights. It's John Locke. It's others talking about natural rights. We just have rights. And one of them is the consent of the governed is necessary for a leader. You cannot be a leader and lead a people or be a sovereign over a political entity if you don't have the consent of the governed. It's one of many natural rights. Life, liberty. For Locke, it's pursuit of property. He's all about that private property. And he goes through all kinds of mental gymnastics to justify it, because there's nothing about private property in the Bible, but that's a more philosophy, political science kind of end. We could talk about it in class if you want to. Natural rights, largely, this is the Two Treatises on Government. That's 1690. A letter concerning toleration is 1689. That's about religious toleration. Also very influential for the colonies. So John Locke is a big deal. I'll say more on why he's not a big deal in a second. But first, something our book doesn't mention at all, as far as I could tell. The Zenger case. This is important, man. 1733, there's a court case. John Peter Zenger has a printing press. He has a newspaper, and he publishes some scandalous stuff about the colonial governor of New York. The government of New York sues Zenger for libel, right? Saying, like, you said something about me and it's bad and it's, it's not true, right? I didn't do those things. Turns out he did do those things. Zenger's defense uses this line of argument in their defense, saying, look, it's not libel, it's not slander. If it's true, the stuff that Zenger said is true, so you need to acquit. He is acquitted. He's not found guilty. And this is a really important moment in pre-revolutionary history, because it establishes this idea that the press has a certain amount of freedom. The British government is going to crack down on press freedoms as we approach the actual revolution. And obviously, the First Amendment, like a lot of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights is, yeah, sure, it's forward-looking to some degree, but it's very, very much in response to issues in the pre-revolutionary period, having to do with speech, search and seizure, seizure of arms, freedom of the press, you name it. Cruel and unusual punishment, jury trials that weren't fast or were in far off places. All of this stuff that you'll learn about in Gov and you'll learn about in a few weeks in our class, in the Bill of Rights, they're reactions to things the colonists didn't like that were happening in the 1730s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Right? So the Zenger case is really, really important to understand not only press freedoms moving into the Revolution, but also after the Revolution, why people were so keen on the idea of enshrining press freedoms in the Bill of Rights. Okay, so we got the Great Awakening. It's a big deal. We've got the Enlightenment. It's a big deal. But look, if we're going to actually talk about real history, then we also need to take into account the fact that, look, you think everyone is reading John Locke? Like the average, free-holding farmer was reading John Locke in their free time and like having political debates? Absolutely not. That's not. They're no more influential than if I said to you, Thomas Piketty or Martin Hogland. Would you know those names? No, right? But they're influential philosophers, right? Economists writing about our current moment. Are they influential? Not really. What's more influential in this time period is British reform movements. And British reform movements are being reprinted. So yeah, the Enlightenment is a big deal, but the colonists really are more inspired by, and they're a part of this, right? They're a part of a British reform movement, liberal reforms. And when we say liberal here, we mean like classic liberal. John Locke is a liberal, right? Liberal in this time period, really up until the New Deal. The term liberal is what we might in the modern era call like a libertarian, right? Free markets, free trade, less government, or government being involved to a certain degree. But the point of the economic system is not just to get the government rich. That's liberalism, right? That is just what it is, right? So these people are political liberals. They're in Parliament. And they're writing about why they want to reform the British government. This goes way back in terms of things being reprinted and being influential. In the 1600s, we covered this last period, right? The indentured servants, Bacon's Rebellion, all of this. Why these British indentured servants were so like up in their feelings about their rights was because in the 1600s, the Magna Carta was being reprinted. Right, with printing presses and paper and print culture, so that like average people could have a little copy of the Magna Carta, which again establishes more parliamentary monarchy, more rights in Parliament, less power for the king, and it inspires them. In the mid-1700s, a similar thing is happening with these radical speeches that are being made in Parliament. These are, again, political radicals in this time period are political liberals. People pushing back against mercantilism, people pushing back against the authority of the king, people demanding more rights for Parliament, more representative democracy. These are radicals in the mid-1700s, but they are what we would call political liberals. Two of the most prominent, William Beckford and, more importantly, John Wilkes. These are people who are, again, they're in Parliament and they're very, very critical of George III. They make speeches against George III, and they publish things that are critical of George III. Wilkes actually is also tried for libel in publishing something against George III. And this is like weird arcania, but it matters for understanding the American Revolution. There's a newspaper called The North Briton, and in issue number 45, Wilkes publishes a piece that is very critical of George III. Wilkes is charged with treason. Not with treason, with libel, and goes to court and all this. So Wilkes becomes a figure of, radical critique of George III. It helps that 1745 is also this thing, the Jacobite Rising. The Jacobite Risings, they tried to, reinstall a Stuart king into the. It's a whole backstory. But the issue 45 and that it was 1745 as the Jacobite uprising matters because when you look at this cartoon, this is a colonial cartoon of someone getting tarred and feathered, and you see here that little 45 on the hat. This is a kind of like low-key symbol in a lot of revolutionary stuff, and it references Wilkes, and it references also this Jacobite uprising, this is not John Locke. This is not some highfalutin philosophy. This is English reform movements, English movements for social justice that are demanding more rights for English people. And that's what the colonists are tapping into, more than some, high-toned philosophy. They're tapping into, and they see themselves as a part of this, right? They don't like George III. They don't like Parliament. They want more rights. People in England are saying the same thing. It's not as though the 13 colonies were exceptional in this regard, and we see that here. So when we look at the years before the Revolution and the ideas that are circulating in print, it's important to remember that it's not just about, Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, and then on the other hand, John Locke. There is a reform movement in the colonies and in Britain that is very influential over the ideas of, like, maybe the king has too much power. Maybe we need to have more or better representation in Parliament. Maybe we should have a say in our taxes. Again, it's not revolution yet. John Wilkes isn't asking for revolution. William Beckford isn't asking for revolution. They're critiquing King George. Right? That's the same thing that the colonists are doing, really up until the last minute, right? Up until the really almost till like 1776. It's just a critique of Parliament and wanting more rights as British citizens. So that is the role of the Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, and, importantly, organic British reform movements in creating an idea that maybe we should have, we the colonists should have more rights, freedoms, say.